Hey everybody, Brett from AstartesGaming here, back with another Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord developer blog video. Today we're checking out the blog from the last entry in March, which is March 29th, 2018. This one is looking at siege engines. This is probably my favorite developer blog that they've put up in a while, because it actually goes into some pretty good detail as to what we can expect from siege battles in Bannerlord, as well as what the different types of engines are and how they might be used in the game. So let's go ahead and dive on in. Greetings, warriors of Calradia. Built in strategic and highly defensible locations, castles enable lords to exert power over the surrounding populace and protect their lands against any would-be invaders. Towering parapets give the defenders vantage points from which to rain down a hail of missiles on anyone foolish enough to try a direct assault, and thick, sturdy walls to provide ample protection for those within. But castles were not invulnerable to attack, although they were more invulnerable than most media gives them credit for. It took a very long time to knock down the walls of a castle, more than any movie or TV show generally represents. As with any sort of arms race, for every type of defense developed, an equally ingenious counter was conceived. In this week's blog, we'll take a look at some of the impressive tools of warfare that were used to overcome a castle's defenses, and discuss the role that siege engines will play in Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord. So first we have the not the lowly, the humble siege ladder. That humble. I'll pan down so you guys can get a better look at it in just a second. But siege ladders offer the simplest form of assault to a besieging army: Escalade. Not a Cadillac Escalade, but, you know, getting over the top. Naturally, this kind of direct assault put the defending forces at a great advantage, with the top of each ladder acting as a choke point. Actually, the entire ladder, because you can't really pass somebody on a ladder. So, yeah, you were vulnerable the entire way up, and also in setting it up. Anyways, the purpose of this kind of assault might not have necessarily have been to overrun the defenders, but perhaps to capture a vital strategic point, such as a gatehouse, which would allow the main assault to commence. My assumption was that ladders were generally used as sort of a way to keep the defenders honest, because obviously there are strategic points where you're going to want to focus your heavier siege equipment on. You know, the gatehouse you're going to take a battering ram to. Or excuse me, the gate itself. The gatehouse you might try to assault with siege towers, but ladders are cheap and you can, you know, get in fairly high quantities. So by having lots of ladders, you can attack virtually the entire castle or the entire, you know, outer wall, while, you know, directing the heavier stuff toward the important locations. And so that keeps the enemy from you know, centering all their forces on just those key locations, because obviously if, you know, you aren't attacking an unimportant part of the wall, they're not going to defend it. They're going to move those defenders to the gatehouse or something like that. So yeah, in my mind, ladders have always been more of a way of keeping the defenders honest than something that you would use to target vital strategic points. Generally, I think you would use something a little bit more reliable than men climbing a ladder one at a time. So in Bannerlord, they are used in much the same way. Siege ladders act as a way for troops to scale the wall, spread the defending troops thinly, and exploit weaknesses in the defense. So it sounds like here they're agreeing with my reasoning more than their own reasoning. That's kind of strange. So yeah, the whole point is to spread the defending troops out by attacking everywhere rather than just at those strategic points. However, units are completely exposed when deploying ladders, and ultimately that risk could be all for naught, as ladders can be pushed away from the wall by defenders. That's something I really like, because there's very few things more satisfying than like kicking a siege ladder off of a wall while there's somebody trying to climb it. So that's something I'm definitely looking forward to. I think it'll be a lot of fun and add a lot of dynamic gameplay to the game, whereas, you know, before ladders were static, they were essentially just a ramp that you walked up. Now they're actually ladders, and they can be deployed or they can be pushed off. And so here we get a picture of a ladder. pretty long, as you would expect, and you know, very simple as well, and so they can be kicked right off of that. And I imagine that a lot of, or basically every siege will probably employ these in fairly high quantities, so you'll be seeing a lot of those. And it's nice that, again, they've taken the time to make them function like their real-world counterparts, because you'll be seeing these so often that it would be very noticeable if they didn't. Alright, so next we move on to siege towers. Siege towers worked on a similar principle to siege ladders in that they allowed attackers to negate a wall by climbing over it. Siege towers offered one distinct advantage over ladders, though. Their partially enclosed design, or in some cases fully enclosed, offered some level of protection to attacking troops and would allow a greater number of warriors to assault a wall at the same time. Again, so what I was saying before is that this is something that you would use to target more strategic locations, because this is a little bit more reliable. It does become a target in and of itself because, you know, it is more dangerous than a ladder. But the people inside are better protected, so they're more likely to, you know, arrive at their destination. You can also employ or deploy more men at that location once it arrives, because you're not funneling them one at a time up a ladder. You are, you know, deploying a ramp that several people can move across at once. And then the fact that these are on wheels means that they're fairly mobile, and they don't need to be lugged around by the people that are going to be using it. The people will already be, you know, ready to deploy inside here, and there will be a couple people behind it pushing, and those people will be protected as well. Whereas, again, with the ladders, you're completely exposed if you're carrying it. So, anyways, in Bannerlord, siege towers work in exactly the same way. They provide protection to troops as they make their way towards a wall before lowering a drawbridge for the attackers to rush across. However, siege towers can be destroyed by the defending force, so a player should make sure to suppress any defensive siege weapons before committing a tower to an assault. So that's good to hear. I mean, we knew, I think, a long time ago, since like the first siege gameplay video that we saw, that these things can be destroyed. I think we saw a battering ram get destroyed by a ballista or something in the initial video. But this does add a lot of dynamics to siege combat, because now, as the attacker, you're going to want to make sure that you have adequate ranged siege weapons to deal with the enemy's ranged siege weapons, because you don't want to leave like a fire ballista up on the walls that can, you know, target these and burn them to the ground, especially if you have a bunch of men in them. That will take out a very large chunk of your army all in one go. So you'll have to sit there and conduct, you know, like a proper assault where you use like your trebuchets or your catapults to hopefully knock out some strategic locations and enemy siege equipment, and then start deploying your assault forces in towers and with ladders and things like that. So we'll get a more natural progression to sieges, which I think will be a lot of fun. Good old battering ram is next. So battering rams allow attacking armies to make a more direct approach when assaulting a castle, and worked through a mixture of momentum and good old-fashioned brute force. The idea was fairly simple: attach a metal head to a tree trunk, sometimes not even that, just using a tree trunk. Then swing it repeatedly at a door, gate, or wall until it gave way. That said, swinging a battering ram at like a stone wall probably wouldn't get you anywhere, but a door or a gate certainly. In Bannerlord, battering rams are only effective against the outer gates of a castle, and, like siege towers, they can be destroyed. They have a roof to protect against light missile fire from above. However, defensive siege weapons can destroy this cover, exposing the troops within. So it's sort of implied in that there is progressive destruction of these things, which is fantastic, because it would be a real shame if, like, targeting the roof was enough to just destroy the entire thing outright. But it sounds like the roof can be destroyed and the thing is still functional. The people operating it are just more vulnerable now. So you'll have to actually destroy, you know, the roof of it and then destroy the actual functional part of it. or destroy the roof and kill everybody operating it to actually, stop it from functioning, which is good. That's, realistic. So Ballista. Ballistae worked like a kind of giant crossbow by using torsion to launch a spear-sized arrow or bolt at such high velocity that it would pierce any type of armor and decimate anyone unlucky enough to be standing in its way. My thoughts regarding Ballistae, or Ballistae, are that they're sort of like counter siege weapons. They are not going to be effective against walls, obviously. They may be effective against doors to some degree, and gates, depending on the type of gate, especially if you're using like flaming bolts or something. But obviously you're not going to knock down a wall with a ballista. That's just not going to happen. So generally what you would do with these, and I think the main application for them in Bannerlord is going to be to target the enemy's siege equipment. So, using a flaming ballista, which they talk about in just a second, you could target, say, a siege tower and try to put a bolt through it and set the thing on fire. Or the same goes for the battering ram, where, you could fire a ballista bolt straight through the roof into the people operating it below, or potentially, dismantling the mechanism that requires it, that is required for it to function. So, yeah, to me, these are going to be most often employed in like counter siege tactics. Not to say that the attacking army wouldn't be able to make use of these as well. Obviously, the defenders will have siege equipment too, and so your ballista may want to target their siege equipment, while the defending ballistas are going to be doing the same thing. So anyways, in Bannerlord, both attacking and defending armies and sieges will have access to Ballistae. They provide a way for attackers to pick away at the defending troops before committing to a full-scale assault. I don't know how reliable that would be, because you have very limited shots with the ballista. I don't know how many or how much ammo they are going to give you. If this is an accurate representation here, it looks like you have somewhere around 9 to 10 shots. And it does mention later that the fire one actually gets less ammo. But that seems like it would be a waste to target individual units, unless there was like 1 or 2 particular guys on the battlefield that were a greater threat than everybody else. Those 10 shots, if that's accurate, would be much better spent targeting enemy siege equipment. Archers can deal with individual people. You don't want to be wasting ballista bolts on, a spearman or something. That's just stupid. So anyways, or to help open any choke points that might develop as the battle progresses. That's sort of an interesting thought. I don't know how much that's going to be a thing in Bannerlord. In Warband, you have the typical siege scenario where there is this pre-existing gap in the wall somewhere, and your ladders are already leaned up against it, or your siege tower is moved to engage it, but the enemy defending, or the defenders, are all sort of just piled up in that area waiting for you to come attack that one spot. And so in that situation, using a ballista to deal with choke points would be really effective, because they're already standing there waiting for you. You just keep firing bolts into that little choke point until they decide to move or you've killed them all. In Bannerlord, because the siege mechanics are going to be so much more dynamic, the choke points I don't think are going to be happening in locations that are that open and obvious. They will happen. There's going to be choke points in a siege, but I think they're going to happen in places like inside the gatehouse, or maybe along the walls in certain areas. I don't think it'll be something that you could easily target with ballista, but maybe you could. I don't know. We'll see. Anyways, likewise, defending troops may wish to use Ballistae to dwindle the numbers of the approaching enemy, or they could turn their attention toward enemy siege engines to prevent them from reaching the walls, and that, again, is what I think they'll be most useful for. Ballistae also have a fire projectile variant, which takes longer to build and has less ammunition than the standard kind, but is much more powerful against enemy siege engines. And so without obviously having played the game or having any meta knowledge regarding it, I think that that variant will probably be the more popular one. Just because, again, I think the real use of this weapon is dealing with enemy siege equipment, whether on the attacking side or the defending side. And so I would rather have fewer shots that are more effective against siege engines rather than a couple of extra that are less effective. And here we get a look at one. I don't know if there's going to be multiple variants other than just like regular or fire. It doesn't sound like there will be. So they'll all probably look like this. And the fire one will just have like a flaming, you know, like a bit of, like a rag tied to the end that's been doused in oil or something and set alight. But otherwise it should be identical. So the mangonel, these are a type of catapult. I've heard them kind of use, or I've heard people use this name interchangeably with onager, but there are some distinctions depending on who you ask. And I think traditionally you would call it an onager if it was more like classical period, because the Romans used onagers. And onagers typically used a sling rather than this like cup thing, like a giant spoon. So that would be the distinction in my mind, but it depends on who you ask or what like your resources are. So the mangonel is a more medieval catapult. And again, they can actually have slings. There are examples of mangonels with slings, but for the most part, they use this, I guess, like a more typical spoon type construction. I think more when the average person thinks of a catapult, this is more what they think of. But very often throughout history, they use slings instead of this because it's easier to kind of add centripetal force to an object in a sling. However, with their more modern technology, they were able to, you know, make good use of this as well. So yeah, we'll get into trebuchets later, but trebuchets, for example, use slings. You can kind of see it here. Anyways, another type of catapult used in siege warfare was the mangonel. The main aim of the mangonel was to create a breach in the castle walls by launching large projectiles from a bucket placed at the end of an arm. They were also used to hurl carcasses and excrement over the walls in an attempt to spread fear and disease among enemy troops. I don't know if this is accurate, but one of my assumptions regarding the transition from the sling to this like little spoon design was that these are easier to load, and you can load a greater variety of things into them. But that, again, is just an assumption of mine, and I don't know if that's true or if there's a different reason for that development, but who knows? I'm sure somebody does. Anyway, as with Ballista, both attacking and defending armies will have access to mangonels in Bannerlord. I imagine the defending ones will probably be fixed at certain points along the walls, maybe at like the main towers, so they won't be, you know, mobile. Although they may be able to pivot. That'll be interesting to see, because there are examples of, you know, like catapults and trebuchets that were on sort of like a simple track system that could be rotated but not actually move beyond that. So we'll see. Obviously, if they're fixed and can only fire straight ahead, that gives the defenders kind of a disadvantage. But who knows? I'm sure they've considered all this in their balancing. So players can build a standard version which can be used to target and destroy Merlons during sieges. Merlons are, if you think of like a typical like Western European medieval castle, like what generally comes to mind, the square teeth that come up at the top of the walls, the actual protruding square part, it doesn't have to be square, but the actual protruding part is called a merlon. And then the gaps in between are called embrasures. And then the entire, you know, overall thing that they are part of is called either crenellations or battlements, depending on who you're talking to. But the merlons are like the little teeth that stick up. and so, enemy archers and crossbowmen would hide behind those, use them as cover, and you could smash them down with rocks, and then they don't have cover. So exposing enemy troops stationed on the wall. There's also a fire variant which deals more damage to enemy siege engines and has an area of effect type damage against troops. So again, the fire variant to me sounds way more awesome, but it doesn't really say how it is going to affect walls. So maybe the trade-off here is that the standard variant is more effective against the Merlons and walls, and the fire variant is more effective against siege engines and troops. So that being the case, I think the attackers would probably want the default, and the defenders might want the fire one. But again, that's just assumptions based on what I'm reading here. And then we have trebuchets. Trebuchets were perhaps the most powerful type of siege engine used in ancient and medieval warfare. They used a pivot arm to throw projectiles over great distances and came in two different designs: traction, which was powered by people, and counter. I don't know if this is supposed to be French, so it could be counterpoise or counterpoise. I'm going to go with counterpoise because I'm American and I don't know if this is a French word. The first word is, English, so I'm going to assume the rest is. Which used a weight at the short end of the arm, which is what you're seeing here. In Bannerlord, you can expect to see the counterpoise trebuchet being used by besieging armies, and typically this is what you see. I have seen examples of traction ones, but more often than not, you see them with a counterweight, just because having a bunch of people constantly having to reset this with ropes and stuff requires a lot of manpower, and I think generally it's just easier to build it with the counterweight. Or maybe not easier to build it, maybe, because you'd need a lot of ropes and pulleys and stuff happening, more so than just what you have here to do the traction version. So where do we leave off? Anyway, in Bannerlord, you can expect to see, we already read that, then they can be used to devastate defending troops from a relatively safe distance and destroy Merlons and mantlets. Mantlets are like essentially wooden barricades. I guess they don't have to be wood, but generally they were. So they're wooden barricades that can be used to either attack or defend. In terms of like defensive stuff in sieges, generally they were sort of like wooden shutters that could cover embrasures and be opened to like drop rocks out of, or to fire an arrow out of, and then closed again, or they might have embrasures cut into them even. And then for attacking, they could either be like fixed, sort of like fixed barricades for attacking archers to hide behind as they, fired arrows at the defenders, or they could even be put on wheels and, pushed forward towards the walls to advance behind. So that's what a mantlet is, and we've already talked about Merlins. Trebuchets can also be built as a fire variant, which has an area of effect type damage that is extremely effective against enemy troops. So the main difference between a trebuchet and a like catapult or mangonel is these are going to fire in a much flatter arc, and generally at a higher velocity. So think of the mangonel as like a sort of like a direct fire thing, whereas the trebuchet is going to be firing in a very high arc. So generally with a trebuchet, you're not going to be targeting stuff on the front face of the castle. You're going to be throwing stuff over the walls or onto the top of the walls. Whereas a mangonel, you could just fire directly into the front of the castle. Not to say that you couldn't throw stuff over a wall with the mangonel, but depending on the height of the wall and where this is placed, you may not have the arc required. So this is what you'd use to target stuff behind the walls. And that is it, I believe. Regarding the trebuchet, it seems like the overall use will be fairly similar to the mangonel. Again, I think the attackers are probably going to want to stick with the standard versions if it's true that, if my assumption is correct, that they're going to be more effective against walls and stuff like that. Whereas I think the defenders are going to want to take the fire variants that are going to be more effective against siege engines and troops. But again, that's all pure assumption based on just what I've read here. So anyways, how do siege engines actually, or excuse me, how do sieges actually work in the game? When laying siege, an army surrounds a castle and cuts off the defender's supply from the outside world. Prices of goods significantly rise as materials begin to run low, and eventually the defenders can be starved into submission. This of course takes some time to happen, so it can be rather costly for an attacking force not to press its advantage when it has the chance. After all, wages still need to be paid and soldiers still need to eat. One thing, since it sounds like they're going to move on to the actual assault part and not really discuss the starving out, one thing I hope that they fix in Bannerlord is in Warband, starving out enemies wasn't really an option. That isn't to say that you couldn't do it. It is possible to do in the game, but it's not something that you can really get away with. The period that it takes relative to how long everything else takes in game is way too long. It's usually upwards of 30 days, which in the game is like an eternity. So you could lose an entire war in the time it takes you to starve out a single castle. And so I'd like to see them do something about that to make that a more viable option. Of course, there's going to be downsides to doing it that way, but it's still, I think, something that would add a lot more realism to the game, because very often in history, that's how castles were taken. Not to say that they were always taken that way, but it did happen quite often, because it was a lot easier than throwing a lot of men at walls and losing a lot of your army doing it. So I would just like to see some balance there where that's actually a viable option again, because in Warband I would argue that it's not. I don't know if anybody would argue against that, but I certainly have never been inclined to do it. Even if I was attacking a numerically superior defensive force, I would rather assault than try to wait them out. Anyways, assuming that the besieging army doesn't want to starve out their opponent, they can choose to build siege weapons to be used in an assault, with each siege engine taking a set amount of time to build depending on the type and level. So this also factors into what I was saying about the Trebuchet and the Ballista. I don't know why I said it like that. The Ballista and the Mangonel, is that we know that the fire variants take longer to build. So when you are besieging something, it seems like there's also incentive to go with the default version, just because it'll require less building time, so you can assault quicker. And then again, it seems like they'll be more effective anyways, because they are better suited to what you're trying to do as an attacker. So as soon as a siege engine, as soon as an engine is built, it can be used to bombard the castle on the campaign map or launch an assault on the battle map. That's a really cool feature. So you can actually conduct some sort of like siege warfare from the campaign map rather than just encirclement. You can work on destroying the walls before actually launching the assault. That's actually very interesting and a very cool feature. One thing I'd like to see is, because they discussed this earlier, but they seem to have neglected it in the actual mechanics, and I'm sure modders could do this fairly easily, is they discussed throwing like carcasses and stuff over the walls to cause pestilence, or throwing severed heads to lower morale. If this whole campaign map siege thing is a feature in the game, then that would be the perfect way to implement those things, because you could throw carcasses over the wall from the campaign map and then see that reflected by some sort of attrition happening among the defenders, or throwing heads over the wall constantly, and that would lower the morale of the defenders. So it doesn't look like it's going to be in the base game, but that's something I think modders could definitely add, and something that would add a ton of strategy to sieges on top of all this new strategy that's already been implemented. Anyways, attacking on the campaign map can create breaches in the wall, which will make the final assault easier. However, this will result in casualties for both of the armies involved, so players should weigh up the positives of creating a breach with the cost involved in terms of time and manpower. That confused me a little bit. So, creating breaches in the wall, great, makes final assault easier. Makes sense. However, this will result in casualties for both of the armies involved. Why would creating a breach in a wall result in casualties for me, the attacker? That I don't understand. Or unless they just worded this poorly and they're talking about the final assault, because obviously the final assault will result in casualties for both sides. That's, I think, given. But then they go on to say, so players should weigh up the positives of creating a breach with the cost involved in terms of time and manpower. To me, it does sound like they're saying that creating a breach is going to cost you men as an attacker, but that doesn't make any sense. If I'm sitting back at a distance, just throwing rocks at a wall with a trebuchet until it breaks, that shouldn't cost me any men, at least not casualties, you know. Men have to operate the trebuchet, sure, but they shouldn't be at any real risk in doing so. I guess unless the enemy has trebuchets, in which case, yeah, them firing back could cause casualties, but I wouldn't think they'd be significant. I don't know. That whole thing kind of confuses me a little bit. So anyways, defenders have a trick or two up their sleeve. They can sally out to meet the attackers at any time. This is one thing that I was really intrigued with, because as a lot of you will probably know from playing Warband, that certain very cavalry heavy factions, which I will refrain from naming, don't do particularly well with sieges, because all their troops are based around, you know, mounted combat, and they don't do particularly well on foot in siege battles. So if you were playing an army like that, rather than actually fighting the siege battle, you could just sally out and attack every time, and that would give you some sort of counter to, say, an army that's very infantry heavy and is more or better suited to sieges. So I think that's a very important addition that will help balance the game. And let's see, so what's next? Or wait for a relief force to arrive and break the siege. That's always been a thing. In the battle map, they have a well-protected position to hold with an endless supply of ammunition and murder holes from which they can throw projectiles and burning jars down on the troops below. So endless supply of ammunition has always been a thing, although some mods remove that. But in native, you constantly get your ammunition resupplied, and in a lot of mods, that feature is retained. Murder holes are new, and we've seen a little bit of that. I don't know why I keep fusing words. We've seen a little bit of that in the Siege gameplay videos, where the player was like dropping rocks down a murder hole onto people that were trying to attack an inner gate. So that's a really nice addition too, and one that really helps with realism. We haven't gotten to see any burning jars, I don't think, but maybe I'm wrong. It has been a while since I've watched them, but that's obviously a nice addition as well. And one that may be very helpful for, I don't know if there's any overlap between the murder holes and the siege engines, where maybe they're pushing a, I think they said specifically that the battering ram only can hit the outer gate. Let's see, where was that? Only effective against the outer gates of a castle. Okay. But if they have like a double layered gate system, like in the gatehouse or whatever, would that still be considered both outer gates? Because I would think if you knock down a gate and there's like another gate immediately behind it, you could just push it a little bit further. But maybe not. I guess we'll have to wait and see on that one. But in that case, you could drop burning jars down on it. It doesn't sound like you'll be able to, though. I don't think they're going to be able to move the battering rams up any further than just the initial gate on the outside. But who knows? We'll find out. Anyways, in the end, sieges are bloody and costly affairs for all parties involved. They are chaotic and brutal, but they sure are a lot of fun. And they definitely look like it. From the gameplay we've seen, the sieges seem really dynamic, really interesting. They don't play out just like meat grinders in the way that they did in Warband, where, you know, there's one entry point, two armies, one of them waiting for the other to charge through the single entry point. And it becomes this very linear, like, tug of war at that point, or any choke point leading up to it. So with these, it seems like they're going to be a lot more dynamic. There are several different points of entry for each castle, and you know, depending on your strategy, some might be more viable than others. You actually have to come up with a strategy for attacking things, because if you aren't careful, you can lose your siege equipment to the defender siege equipment or the attacker siege equipment. So there's a lot to consider in these, and I think that'll really add to the enjoyment of them, because they become kind of a chore in Warband, and I think in Bannerlord they'll be a real highlight. Anyways, that is it for today's blog. They don't give any indication as to what will be next. I would like to see more on the fief system. I've discussed this in other videos, but essentially the way the fief system works in Bannerlord is that every fief is basically just a simple village, and then various upgrades can be added to that turn it into like a castle or a town. So they all essentially start as a village, but at the beginning of the game some will be more upgraded than others, and I'd like to see more detail on that, because we've only seen very superficial information about it, and they never even discussed it. We just got like screenshots or little bits of video that kind of glossed over it, so that's something I'd really like to see more from them. But anyways, we'll leave it here for today. So anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. I had a great time discussing some siege tactics and Bannerlord with you, and I look forward to seeing you guys back here for the next episode.